The late afternoon sky over rural Ohio was a muted wash of burnt orange and dusky purple. Long shadows stretched across the fields, and a soft breeze stirred the dry corn stalks standing like sentinels along the narrow country road. Ethan Miller gripped the steering wheel of his aging Ford pickup truck with one hand, the other resting on the gearshift as he guided the vehicle along the winding asphalt. His shirt was damp with sweat from a long shift at the metal fabrication plant in Dayton, and a familiar ache in his lower back reminded him of every hour spent on the assembly line. He was eager to get home. Dinner, a cold shower, maybe a beer, and silence. These were the comforts waiting for him in the small rented house he had moved into 6 months earlier. His phone sat silent on the passenger seat. No missed calls. No new messages. Just another evening alone, the way most of his evenings had been since his mother passed 3 years ago and his younger sister moved to Colorado. That's when he saw her. At first, she appeared as little more than a silhouette, a small figure standing near a mile marker just off the shoulder of the road. As he got closer, he realized it was an elderly woman, perhaps in her 70s, with silver hair pinned back neatly in a long, brown overcoat buttoned all the way to her neck. She was holding a small leather suitcase, aged but well kept, and staring toward the horizon as though waiting for something or someone. Instinct told Ethan to drive on. It was getting late, and he had seen too many headlines about what could go wrong when picking up strangers. But something about her made him slow down. She didn't look distressed, but there was a quiet dignity in the way she stood there. She didn't wave him down, didn't signal for help. She simply waited. Before he could talk himself out of it, Ethan eased his foot off the gas and pulled to a stop a few feet ahead of her. He rolled down the passenger window. "Ma'am, you okay out here?" The woman turned slowly, her eyes calm but sharp. "I believe I am, but I'd be better if I could catch a ride. Headed west." Ethan glanced at the empty road stretching behind her. There weren't any towns for miles. "Yeah," he said cautiously. "I can give you a lift. You sure you're all right?" "I'm fine, dear. Just need to get to Millersburg, if that's not too far off for you." Millersburg. That was 20 minutes out of his way, but he nodded. "Not a problem. Hop in." The woman smiled, her face lined with years but somehow soft. "Thank you, young man." She opened the door, placed her suitcase carefully on the floor, and settled into the seat with surprising ease. She smelled faintly of lavender and old paper. Ethan waited until she fastened her seatbelt before pulling back onto the road. They drove in silence for a few minutes, the sound of tires on pavement and the occasional rustle wind through open windows filling the space between them. Ethan couldn't help glancing over at her now and then. She sat with perfect posture, hands folded in her lap, gazing ahead as though she'd driven this road 1,000 times. "I'm Ethan, by the way," he said finally, just to break the quiet. "Margaret," she replied with a nod. "It's nice to meet you, Ethan." "Millersburg's a bit out of the way," he said. "You have family there?" She gave a small, amused smile. "You could say that. Haven't been back in years, but some places never stop calling you." Ethan nodded, though he didn't fully understand. "You from around there originally?" "Long ago," she said. "Back when that gas station on Route 30 still had glass pumps. Before the new high school was built. Everything's different now, of course. But then again, some things aren't." There was something about the way she spoke that made Ethan feel like he was being studied. Not in a creepy way. More like she already knew something about him and was waiting to see if he'd notice. "You travel a lot?" he asked, trying to keep the tone light. "Only when I need to," she replied, still looking out the window. "I've spent most of my life right here in Ohio. Married young. Worked in a library for decades. I've seen more stories and pages than I ever have on the road." A librarian. "Huh? That's cool," Ethan said. She chuckled. "It has its quiet charms." They passed a field where cows were grazing, and the road dipped into a short stretch of woods. The sun was almost gone now, and the sky darkened to a deep indigo. Ethan reached over and turned on the headlights. The beam caught the edges of her suitcase briefly, and he noticed the initials MJ stamped near the handle in faded gold letters. Something about the moment felt off, not wrong, just unusual, like a memory he couldn't quite place. He shook the thought away. "You're sure you're all right?" he asked again, his voice lower this time. "I mean, standing out there alone like that, that's not something you see every day." Margaret turned to him then, really looked at him for the first time. Her eyes, a pale blue, were steady and kind, but there was something beneath them, a depth, a weight. "I appreciate your concern, Ethan, but don't worry. I knew you'd stop." That made his hands tighten slightly on the wheel. "You knew I would." She smiled but said nothing. The silence returned, deeper this time. Not uncomfortable, exactly, but heavy, like the beginning of something he hadn't expected. Ethan drove on, watching the road, but feeling, for the first time in a long time, like he was being pulled into a story much older than himself. And Margaret, with her calm demeanor and suitcase full of memories, seemed to be the one turning the pages. The truck moved steadily along the darkening road, its headlights carving narrow paths through the thickening dusk. The landscape had shifted into rolling hills and denser groves of trees, their branches swaying under the gentle pressure of the evening breeze. Inside the cab, the quiet hum of the engine filled the space between Ethan and Margaret. Neither had spoken for several minutes, but it was not the awkward silence of strangers unsure of what to say. It was something else, a pause that seemed intentional, as though Margaret was waiting for the right moment to speak again. Then, with her eyes still fixed on the road ahead, she broke the silence. "You know, I always love this time of day," she said softly, "just before night settles in. There's a stillness to it that makes people remember things they've tried to forget." Ethan glanced at her, unsure how to respond. "Yeah, I guess it's quieter. Feels different from the rest of the day." "Not just quieter," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "More honest. The light's not pretending anymore. The world shows its edges when the sun goes down." He nodded slowly, not entirely understanding, but unwilling to question her. There was a rhythm to her words that felt practiced, yet deeply personal, as if she had said them to herself many times before. Margaret turned her head slightly, her gaze shifting toward him. "Tell me, Ethan, have you ever made a decision you couldn't take back?" The question landed like a stone dropped into still water. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he tightened his grip on the wheel and exhaled through his nose, eyes fixed on a winding road. "I think everyone has," he said after a moment, "some worse than others. Do you think people change because of those decisions? Or do they just learn to carry them better?" Ethan frowned, caught off guard by the depth of the question. "I don't know. Maybe both. Some people get crushed by them. Others just keep moving." "Even when they don't know where they're going?" she asked, almost to herself. That silence returned, heavy with the weight of things unsaid. The question wasn't rhetorical. Ethan could feel it. She was asking him something deeper, something that went beyond polite conversation. But he wasn't sure how far he was willing to go with a woman he had just picked up from the side of the road. "You seem like someone who's seen a lot," he said instead, steering the conversation in a different direction. Margaret gave a quiet chuckle. "Time has a way of making you pay attention. It doesn't matter how fast you live. Life will always show you the bill." Ethan smirked. "Sounds like something my mom used to say." Margaret's smile faded just slightly, her gaze drifting out the window again. She was a wise woman, your mother. The air inside the truck grew still. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't said anything about his mother. Not her name. Not her death. Nothing. Yet Margaret had spoken as if she knew her. He didn't say anything right away. Instead, he kept driving, his jaw tightening. Maybe it was a lucky guess. Maybe the way he said "used to" had tipped her off. But there was something in the way she said it. Calm, certain, that unsettled him. Margaret didn't look at him. She just kept watching the trees roll past, as if she hadn't said anything unusual. Ethan finally cleared his throat. "What did you say?" "I said your mother was wise," she repeated, still not looking at him. "You knew her?" Now she turned toward him, her eyes unreadable in the dim light. "Not as well as I should have. Not as long as I wanted. But yes, I knew her." Ethan blinked, confusion flooding his expression. "How?" "I mean, she died 3 years ago. We lived in Springfield. You're from Millersburg. Margaret didn't answer right away. Instead, she traced her fingers slowly across the edge of her coat, as if smoothing out invisible wrinkles. "There are people who pass through our lives like storms," she said finally. "Brief, powerful, unforgettable. Your mother wasn't like that. She was the kind of soul that stayed, even after she was gone." Her words sent a chill down Ethan's spine, not because they were ominous, but because they felt true in a way he couldn't explain. He could still hear his mother's voice in quiet moments, could still smell her perfume in the hallway of the house he grew up in. Grief hadn't erased her. It preserved her, like a pressed flower between the pages of time. Margaret's voice was softer now, more distant. "We met when we were young, barely older than you are now. There was a summer when everything felt infinite, and we thought nothing could break us. But life has a way of proving you wrong." Ethan's eyes flicked toward her, the road blurring slightly as he tried to focus on her words. "You were friends." "We were more than that," Margaret said, her voice carrying the weight of 1,000 memories. "But the world wasn't kind to people like us back then. Choices had to be made, promises broken." The confession stunned him into silence. He hadn't expected anything like this. A woman who had walked out of the past and into his truck, now claiming to have shared a life with a person he missed more than anyone. "Why now?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Margaret gave him a long, searching look. "Because sometimes the road decides when it's time to come back." Ethan didn't know what to say. His mind was spinning, trying to connect dots that didn't exist yet. He wanted to ask more, wanted to demand proof, but something about Margaret made him hesitate. Not out of fear, but respect, as if pushing too hard would shatter something fragile between them. Ahead, a highway sign announced that Millersburg was 15 miles away. He glanced at the gas gauge, then at the clock on the dashboard. It was already past 8 o'clock. The sky outside was nearly black now, and the road had emptied completely. Just the two of them, moving through the dark, wrapped in a story that was only beginning to unfold. Margaret shifted in her seat, folding her hands again. "Do you believe in fate, Ethan?" He laughed softly, though it lacked any humor. "Not really. I believe in hard work, in getting through the day." "Fair enough," she said. "But some nights, you'll find that the day wasn't the point at all. It was what waited after." He didn't respond. He couldn't. The road curved gently to the left, and with it came a sense that something was drawing closer. Something invisible but undeniable. Margaret's presence had altered the course of his evening, of his thoughts, maybe even his life. And yet, she sat beside him as calmly as if they were old friends on a long-planned journey. As the silence returned once more, Ethan realized that the quiet wasn't empty. It was full of questions of memory, of a past he never knew existed. And ahead, the night stretched on, waiting to tell the rest of the story. The truck's tires hummed over the asphalt, a steady sound that might have lulled Ethan into a trance on any other night. But now, each mile seemed to stretch unnaturally, every shadow on the roadside tinged with a weight he couldn't name. He gripped the wheel tighter, the muscles in his arms tense, his eyes fixed straight ahead even as his mind turned over everything Margaret had said. She knew his mother, not in passing, not through vague acquaintance, but intimately. The implication of that alone sent tremors through his chest, but it was a calm certainty in her tone that truly unnerved him. She spoke not like someone recounting a story, but like someone stepping back into one that had never fully ended. Neither of them spoke for several miles. Margaret seemed content with the silence, though her eyes never stopped moving, drifting from the road to the horizon, then occasionally to Ethan, watching him with quiet observation. When she finally spoke again, her voice was low and measured. "You look like her, you know, your mother, but it's not just a face. It's the way you hold things in, the way you think before you speak. She was like that too." Ethan glanced at her sharply. "You keep saying that like you knew her well, but I've never seen you before, never heard her mention you." Margaret gave a slow nod, as if she had expected the question. She wouldn't have. Not after everything. There are parts of our lives we bury so deep that even those closest to us never know they're there. He swallowed hard. "You mean secrets?" "I mean truths that were never safe to speak," she said. "Not in the time we lived them. The road began to slope upward as they approached a stretch of hills. The engine strained slightly, and Ethan eased off the gas. The night around them was darker now. Trees on both sides pressing in, their silhouettes jagged and restless. A layer of tension settled over the cab, thick enough to feel. "You're not just someone who knew her, are you?" Ethan asked. "There's something else." Margaret turned her head toward the window, her reflection faint in the glass. "Your mother was the bravest person I ever knew. She loved fiercely. She sacrificed more than anyone realized, and she never asked for anything in return." Ethan's jaw clenched. "That's not an answer." "No, it's not," she said quietly, "but it's the beginning of one." For a few seconds, he considered pulling over. He didn't know why. Maybe to breathe, maybe to run. But something about the way she sat, unmoving and composed, anchored him to the driver's seat. She wasn't unstable. She wasn't lying. That was what made it harder. She believed every word she said. Margaret reached into the pocket of her coat and pulled out a thin slip of paper, folded neatly. She handed it to Ethan without a word. He hesitated, then took it with one hand, eyes darting back and forth between the road and the paper as he carefully unfolded it. It was a photograph, old, yellow with age, its corners worn. In it stood two young women, smiling under a wide oak tree. One of them was unmistakably his mother, her hair longer, her eyes lit with a joy he hadn't seen in years. Beside her stood another woman, her arm draped casually over his mother's shoulder. Margaret. Ethan's stomach turned. He glanced at her, then back at the photo. "Where was this taken?" "In a park just outside of Millersburg," she said. "The summer of 1974. We spent nearly every day there, talking, dreaming, planning lives that were never meant to happen." Ethan stared at the image. His mother couldn't have been older than 20. She looked free in a way he had never imagined her. Not the tired single mother who worked 2 jobs. Not the quiet woman who kept her past carefully hidden behind polite smiles and gentle distance. But someone young, alive, open to possibility. "You loved her," he said finally, his voice flat, not as an accusation but a realization. Margaret nodded. "More than anything. And I lost her when I didn't have the courage to fight for what we had." Ethan felt the truth settle deep in his chest, heavy and disorienting. He thought of all the times he had asked his mother about her younger days, only to be met with vague answers, deflections, quiet laughter that never reached her eyes. He had assumed it was just pain. Maybe it had been, but now he understood there was more. Whole chapters of her life locked away, sealed under pressure of time and fear. "I don't know what to say," he admitted. "You don't have to say anything," Margaret replied. "I didn't come to demand understanding. I came because I made a promise. A long time ago, I told her that if the road ever brought you to me, or me to you, I would make sure you knew the part of her that the world never did." Ethan swallowed again. The words didn't come easily. He stared at the photograph once more before folding it carefully and slipping it into the glove compartment. Margaret sat back, her expression unreadable. "I thought I might never see you, that the time had passed. But when I saw your truck coming down that road, I knew." He shook his head slowly. "You're telling me you were just waiting?" "I was hoping," she said. Hope and waiting are cousins. A flicker of something shifted in Ethan's chest. Not acceptance, not yet, but the beginning of understanding. The picture, the details, the things she knew, they weren't guesses. They were memories. Real ones. And for the first time, he began to feel like his mother wasn't just gone, but still unfolding, revealing herself through someone who had carried her in silence for decades. Ahead, the road began to level out, and a small diner sign appeared in the distance, its red neon letters blinking faintly against the night. Ethan slowed down. "We're stopping?" Margaret asked. He nodded. "Yeah, I think I need a minute." He pulled the truck into the nearly empty parking lot, the gravel crunching beneath the tires. The diner was old but open, lights buzzing inside, a few booths occupied by late-night travelers and truckers. He turned off the engine and sat in silence for a moment, hands still on the wheel. Margaret didn't move. She waited. Ethan finally looked at her, not with suspicion this time, but with something closer to curiosity. "What else did you promise her?" Margaret looked at him, eyes steady. "That I'd tell you everything, when you were ready to hear it." He nodded slowly. "Then let's eat, because I've got questions." As they stepped out of the truck and walked toward the warm glow of the diner, the night air cool on their skin, Ethan felt the weight of years pressing in, but also, for the first time in a long time, a strange sense of possibility. The past wasn't finished. And maybe, just maybe, neither was he. The air inside the diner was thick with the scent of fried food and stale coffee, but it felt oddly grounding after the quiet strangeness of the road. Ethan slid into a booth near the back, while Margaret settled across from him, setting her small leather suitcase on the seat beside her as if it contained something fragile. A waitress approached, asked if they wanted menus, but Ethan shook his head. He wasn't hungry. His mind was too full. He ordered coffee, black. Margaret asked for the same. When the waitress left, the silence returned, but it was no longer awkward. It had weight now, a mutual understanding slowly forming in the stillness between them. Outside the diner's large front window, the world seemed paused. A few cars rolled past on a highway, their headlights catching the edge of the lot, and then disappearing into the dark. Somewhere, a radio played a country song that neither of them could quite make out. Ethan's fingers tapped lightly against the ceramic coffee mug. As soon as it was placed in front of him, the rhythm unsteady. "So," he began, eyes fixed on the liquid swirling inside the cup, "you said you made a promise, that you'd tell me everything." Margaret didn't flinch. Her hands were folded neatly in front of her, and when she spoke, her voice was steady, even. "Yes, your mother didn't like to talk about the past. Not because she wanted to forget, but because remembering made it too real. For her, the silence was survival." Ethan nodded once, the words sinking in like stones in water. He thought of the times he tried to ask her about her younger years, about people he'd seen in old photo albums that mysteriously vanished from the house one day. She had always redirected the conversation, always with a gentle smile and a new subject. And now, finally, the pieces were aligning. "She never married," Ethan said. "Not after I was born. I used to think maybe she loved someone who left, or someone who died, but she never gave a name." Margaret's expression didn't change. She didn't want you growing up with the shadow of someone who'd been erased. She wanted you to have a clean slate, something she never had. Ethan looked up at her then, brows furrowed. "Erased?" "She came from a family that didn't tolerate difference," Margaret said plainly. "We both did, but her father, he was especially cruel. When she told him about us, he gave her a choice, stay and renounce everything or leave with nothing. She left, and she never looked back." Ethan felt his breath catch. He had known his grandfather only through photographs, stern, emotionless, always in uniform. The man had died before Ethan turned 10, but now, with Margaret's words, those old pictures took on a new tone. He remembered the way his mother never spoke of him, the way her mouth would tighten when his name came up. "She protected you," Margaret continued, "in every way she could, even from the truth that she had loved a woman so completely it changed the course of her life." He sat with that for a long moment, absorbing it piece by piece. The past wasn't just a set of facts or dates. It was alive, raw, threaded through everything he thought he knew about the woman who raised him. And now, sitting across from someone who had once shared her heart, he felt the strange weight of inherited silence, something passed down through glances, omissions, and quiet refusals. "I should feel angry," he said eventually, "that she never told me. But I don't. I wish I'd known her better. All of her." Margaret's gaze softened. "That's why I'm here. Not just to tell you what was, but to give you a piece of her that she couldn't carry alone." Ethan took a slow sip of his coffee, his thoughts racing. The story was still forming in his mind, shaping itself into something he hadn't expected. He wanted to ask more, to dig deeper, but the conversation had grown too dense for the confines of a fluorescent-lit diner. He felt restless, like the answers he needed couldn't be contained within four walls. He looked at her. "Let's go." Margaret blinked, slightly surprised. "Go where?" "Back on the road." Ethan said. I don't know why, but I feel like I need to keep moving. Margaret gave a small nod, understanding. Then let's drive. They paid quietly and stepped back into the night. The cold air met them with a bite, the kind that reached through jackets and tugged at skin, but Ethan didn't mind. The sky overhead was black now, heavy with stars. The truck groaned a little as it started up, headlights cutting through the quiet once more. Ethan didn't speak for a while. The truck moved through the hills like a thought half-formed, a question still unspoken. Margaret remained silent too, the suitcase once again by her feet. The road narrowed slightly, dipping into a stretch with no streetlights, only the occasional reflector marking the edges. Eventually, without a word, Ethan pulled the truck onto a gravel turnout, just past a bend in the road. The spot offered a wide view of the valley below, where small pockets of light dotted the landscape. Farmhouses, distant towns, or maybe gas stations. He turned off the engine but left the lights on. Then he looked at her. Tell me the rest. Margaret didn't hesitate. She reached down, gently lifting the suitcase onto her lap. Her fingers traced the worn leather, as though touching something sacred. She opened it with quiet precision, revealing a neatly packed interior. A faded scarf, a couple thin books, and beneath them, a small wooden box. She set the box between them. I've kept this for a long time, she said. She gave it to me the night before she left. Said I'd know when it was time to pass it on. Ethan stared at the box. It was simple, unadorned, but the wood was smooth from handling. No lock, no latch, just a slide-top lid. He reached forward, hesitated, then opened it. Inside were letters. Dozens of them, all addressed in the same graceful handwriting, his mother's. Some were yellowed, others more recent. Folded photographs were tucked between envelopes, each one a frozen memory. A photo of his mother sitting in the grass, barefoot, her smile wide and real. Another of Margaret, holding a small bouquet of wildflowers. And one in particular, that took his breath. The two of them together, seated on a porch swing, holding hands. Ethan didn't speak. He couldn't. His throat tightened as he lifted one of the letters and opened it. Read it, Margaret said gently. He did, and her voice, his mother's voice, filled his head, not through sound, but through the ink on the page. She spoke of fear, of love, of what it meant to choose silence over shame. She spoke of Ethan, of how much he had saved her just by existing. She spoke of Margaret, of the love they had shared, the pain of separation, and the hope that someday her son might know all of it. When he finally finished reading, his hands trembled. He looked at Margaret, eyes wet but focused. Why did you wait until now? Because I had to be sure it would matter, she said. And tonight, when you stopped for me, I knew it finally did. Ethan didn't answer. He reached into the box and took another letter, holding it close. Above them, the stars stretched wide and unbroken. And for the first time in years, he felt closer to his mother, not as a memory, but as a person, whole, flawed, and real. The truck's engine remained off. The valley lay quiet below. And there, in the stillness of the roadside, Ethan began to understand what it meant to inherit not just history, but truth. The wind had picked up since they pulled off the road, brushing through the trees and carrying the faint scent of pine and damp earth. Ethan sat on the edge of the truck bed, one foot planted firmly on the gravel, while the other rested on the bumper, the open wooden box beside him. The letters, once sealed with care and hidden away, were now scattered gently across his lap, each one offering a glimpse into a world he had never known, a world where his mother had loved fiercely, suffered quietly, and written her heart down in ink for someone she never thought he would meet. Margaret sat nearby on the hood, her hands clasped loosely together, her posture straight despite the cold. She had not spoken since handing over the box. There was no need. Ethan had been reading page after page for nearly an hour. As the truck lights dimmed and eventually timed out, the only illumination came from the moon, full and indifferent, casting a pale glow over the gravel turnout. Margaret watched him read, her gaze calm but distant, as if she too was listening to the voice in those letters, though she had likely memorized every word years ago. Eventually, Ethan set a letter down and exhaled deeply. His chest felt heavy, but not with sorrow, At least not entirely. What he felt was a profound sense of expansion, like he had been living in a house with locked rooms and someone had finally handed him the keys. Each sentence, each confession and memory from his mother had begun piecing together the emotional architecture of her life. The boldness of her youth, the pain of separation, the constant balance between self-preservation and love. She never stopped loving you, he said, his voice raw. She kept writing to you, even when she knew you might never read them. Margaret's eyes didn't flinch. I know. I felt her in every letter, even the ones I never held. You said you weren't sure it would matter, Ethan continued, but it always would have. I think, even as a kid, I knew there was something missing, not something wrong, just something unanswered. These letters, he gestured the box. This gives it shape. He looked at Margaret fully now, his eyes clearer than they'd been since they left the factory hours earlier. I want to know everything. Margaret nodded slowly. There isn't much more to explain. We met when we were both 20. I was working at the local library. She came in asking about a book I didn't know anyone else under 60 was still reading. We ended up talking for 3 hours about literature, about politics, about how small towns can be so loud without saying anything at all. It felt like being seen for the first time. She paused, letting the memory settle before continuing. We were careful. We had to be. It was the late 70s in a town where everyone knew your name, your car, your schedule. But even in hiding, we carved out something real. Until she told her father. She thought maybe, just maybe, he'd surprise her. That blood might mean understanding. But instead, he threw her out of the house the same night. No money, no warning. Just the clothes on her back and the words she never repeated to me. Ethan didn't interrupt. He let the silence hold what it needed to. She came to me, and we lived together for a while, Margaret said, her voice steady. Not in public. Not the way people live together now. But in the quiet, in the spaces between everyone else's assumptions, until she realized she was pregnant. Ethan sat straighter, his breath catching. She never told me who the father was, Margaret continued, only that it wasn't what either of us wanted. She'd made a mistake, a desperate one, during a time when we were trying to figure out what the future looked like. She was terrified. She didn't want to bring a child into a world that would treat her like a stranger in her own life. Ethan looked down, not from shame, but from the sudden pressure behind his eyes. The revelation didn't hurt, it explained. The quiet around his birth, the lack of photographs, the absence of father figure that had never been mourned. It wasn't neglect. It was fear and choice and love, all tangled into the same moment. So she left again, Margaret said, her voice soft now. She moved to Springfield, changed her last name, and started over. We wrote letters for a while, but then she stopped answering. I didn't blame her. She needed to build a life that wouldn't collapse under the weight of what we'd lost. Ethan nodded slowly, his fingers brushing the edges of another letter, but she never really let go. No, Margaret agreed. She never could. She just learned to live without showing it. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The sound of the night grew louder, the wind in the trees, the occasional rustle of small animals in the underbrush, the distant rumble of semi on the highway. It all moved around them like water around stones. Finally, Ethan stood. He reached for the wooden box and closed it gently, then set it back into the suitcase. I don't know what I'm supposed to do with all of this, he said, but I don't want to bury it again. Margaret stepped down from the hood and faced him, her eyes steady. You don't have to do anything. Just carry it with you. Remember it. Let it be part of how you understand her and yourself. He met her gaze, and something passed between them that words couldn't quite capture. It wasn't closure. It wasn't even peace. It was something more enduring, recognition, not just of what had been lost, but of what had been preserved against time and fear and distance. We should get back on the road, Ethan said. Millersburg isn't far now. Margaret gave a small nod. She picked up the suitcase, careful as ever, and climbed into the passenger seat. Ethan started the engine, and they rolled slowly back onto the road. The headlights lit the way forward. tracing a path through the dark that no longer felt so uncertain. As they drove, Ethan didn't look back. There was no need. What mattered had already made its way into cab with them. The weight of words, once hidden, had been spoken. And now, the road ahead felt like a continuation, not a journey begun tonight, but of one that had waited for years to be resumed.